Black people didn't live in Montgomery County. Like, that's just not true. At one point, almost a third of the population of Montgomery County was Black people. That same road is the road that a lynch mob took to go to Rockville to hang a young man named John Diggs Dorsey, and then took that same route back up to Darnestown where they could, kiss their loved ones and go to bed at night. So there were forces at play, wealthy forces, to try and kind of rename that whole area. And in so doing, I think, layer over some of that Black history for sure. But one of the things I think that is telling about this merger is that it's a conversation, I think, about power. Often in these sorts of merging, it is the Black experience that gets subsumed, that is glossed over and forgotten.
Unsolicited Perspectives podcast. Episode clip.
I grew up walking up and down Quince Orchard Road, went to Quince Orchard High School, so I knew that name, but I never knew it as a place, right? And so one day, walking into my grandmother's hospital room, she said, "I miss my hometown." I'm like, "Grandma, what are you talking about? We're in Gaithersburg. We're still here, right here." She said, I didn't grow up in Gaithersburg. I wasn't born in Gaithersburg. I was born in Quince Orchard." And I said, "Oh, Grandma, so sad. This is so sad to see such a sharp woman decline so quickly, all that nonsense." And I said, "Grandma, Quince Orchard's not a place. It's a street. Now it's a high school, but it was just a street." And that was like our first tense moment. I couldn't let that slide. So that took me into the archives, right? So I dug into the stacks. I found an article from 1908 where the Washington Post is encouraging Washingtonians to get out of D.C. and go check out some of the surrounding towns. And there in black and white, it says Quince Orchard, right? Which somehow seeing it in print made it real. And so I went back out to my grandmother and said, "Did you ever know that Quince Orchard was a place?" Somehow I needed that validation to go and check the source. But that piece of paper also said Quince Orchard noted for its churches. And that helped me sort of start that conversation to figure out what was going on with this church dynamic. But to your point also on how did this community actually survive this, is really interesting because there is a perception of what Montgomery County is that doesn't exactly align with the history of Black communities, these post-emancipation Black communities that existed across Montgomery County. People like Black people didn't live in Montgomery County. Like, that's just not true. At one point, almost a third of the population of Montgomery County was Black people. And so people will always say, well, that church merger can happen in a place like Montgomery County where you don't have a history of slavery, where you don't have a history of state-sponsored segregation, where you don't have a history of racial terror. And so that's why it was really important for me to sort of capture this fuller story, to say that, go into the stacks to share my family's story of enslavement, not in Montgomery, Alabama, but in Montgomery County, Maryland, to talk about, the existence of segregation in Montgomery County, in Quince Orchard, in Gaithersburg. We talk about history in terms of these kind of iconic moments. Like, we're taught that schools were almost desegregated in Little Rock, Arkansas, not appreciating that my father integrated my elementary school. Like, I didn't know that growing up, but my dad was the first integrated class at Trevilla Elementary, which is where I went for kindergarten. And then similarly, it was really important to talk about that along that same road, called Darnestown Road now, but where this one-room schoolhouse was erected in 1868 to educate colored Black children, that same road is the road that a lynch mob took to go to Rockville to hang a young man named John Diggs Dorsey, and then took that same route back up to Darnestown where they could, kiss their loved ones and go to bed at night. And so it's in that context and in that community that you are able to have these three churches come together and figure out, and still be in the process of figuring out, how it's going to work.
So I have to bring this up because it was something that I noticed while going to Quince Orchard. And there's a difference between Quince Orchard High School and Gaithersburg High School. That the majority of the population at Quince Orchard High School and in Quince Orchard is white. Did the merging of the churches contribute to Black history kind of being pushed aside and erased? And this is the reason why you growing up there all your life and me moving there in high school didn't know these things at
Yeah.
all?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good question. I don't know if I could put that on the back of the merger. And
Okay.
this is why. I mean, I think Quince Orchard as a place was going through significant transition and there was definitely pressure, right? So frankly, it was Quince Orchard for my grandmother's generation. It was Quince Orchard for my father's generation. It was Gaithersburg for me. And now it's North Potomac,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Like
yeah.
it has a whole new moniker for this new generation. And so there was a push to layer over this language of Quince Orchard. When that high school was built, the desire was not for it to be called Quince Orchard High School, right?
Mm,
Even that was the desire was for it to be named some derivation of Potomac, Potomac
mm,
Valley, North Potomac High, something to sort of acknowledge that proximity to Potomac. So there were forces at play, wealthy forces, to try and kind of rename that whole area. And in so doing, I think, layer over some of that Black history for sure. I think they have been happy to layer over the white history in that community too, which, those names also leave behind. I think this was a poor farming community. There are white folks, there are Black folks, and those progressive forces that wanted to name it something new or happy to forget about that poor past altogether. But one of the things I think that is telling about this merger is that it's a conversation, I think, about power.
mm,
I think your question is a great one because so often in these sorts of merging, it is the Black experience that gets subsumed, right? That is glossed over and forgotten. One of the things I think is really powerful about the Fairhaven is the name of the church that was born out of these three churches coming together. They didn't exist in any of the old buildings, right? They
mm,
built a new building. They didn't take on the name of any of the old churches. They built a new church and gave it a new name. And I think kind of brilliant in trying to breathe new life. And the church continues to be sort of evenly distributed from a demographic perspective, but also I think importantly from a leadership perspective. So
mm,
they had those hard conversations about, and the Women's Commission is a good example. They decided early on that they were going to have a Black president one year and a white president the next year. They decided that they were going to do power sharing from the jump. And to your point, I don't know that the population always would have represented that, but they realized that that was necessary for the success. And then the last thing I'll say on this is there were three original churches. Pleasant View was the historically Black congregation. Hunting Hill was one of the white congregations. It had a northern affiliation, and then McDonald Chapel, one of the white churches, that had a southern affiliation. Of those three original churches, only one still remains,
mm,
and it's that Black congregation. It's the Black church that's connected to that schoolhouse, that's connected to that social hall, that's connected to that cemetery plot. And I think it's really important because it's an example of that this merger took place. And to your question about the Black history component, the history components, the buildings, the memories that are connected to those buildings still stand. And now it's our responsibility to preserve them, to translate them, to make them relevant to a new generation. But the fact that those buildings are still there, I think, is a testament to the mindset of those folks that were willing to engage in this merger to preserve a congregation, but to keep this homestead to preserve a culture.
Join the conversation and follow the Unsolicited Perspectives podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio podcasts.